name's Harrison Hurt, and I'm going to be giving a topic analysis for the September-October public forum debate topic. So I'm going to give my own perspective on this topic in this video and talk about some of the things that I think work and don't work from the 4 weeks that I've worked on it this summer. But I would encourage all of you to get the champion briefs for an even greater depth of analysis, actual evidence, and a guest topic analysis written by a constitutional scholar, Dr. Craig Smith, which is really cool. So with that, let's just dive right into the resolution we've got. So the resolution verbatim is, in the United States public K-12 schools, the probable cause standard ought to apply to searches of students. So let's parse down some of the most important pieces of this resolution in its wording. So one of the key parts is obviously the first clause, which sets the boundaries of the resolution, not only to the United States domestically, but also to public K-12 schools. And the reason why that's important is because public schools have different expectations than private schools. They're seen as representations of the government itself, which means that they have stricter legal requirements and a greater obligation, arguably, to the safety of students than private schools do. That was actually part of the justification for the case New Jersey versus TLO, which is a seminal case on this topic that established the reasonable suspicion standard, and I'll go into explaining a bit more about that later. But something that you should know is that as public schools are representative of the government, as they are representations of the government, there's an argument that the way that public school officials are perceived by students shapes the way that those same students will then perceive institutions as a whole. Largely, as a child, in your first 18 years of life, the largest way you have been coming to contact with the government is through engaging in school. You don't vote, you don't go to see your mayor. So having a negative view of your school environment means that you could take a negative view of law and institutions in general, which can lead to a lack of compliance with the law and degrading public trust, which could have serious impacts across the board. So what effect probable cause has on the view of public schools, therefore, can have a large impact on institutions as a whole, and that can be possible ground for either side. Just something to note. Now let's go into the next important part of the resolution to understand, which is the probable cause standard. So a couple things about the probable cause standard. The most important and basic thing about the probable cause standard is that it is a higher standard of evidence than reasonable suspicion, which is the standard for searches in the status quo in schools. Reasonable suspicion standard in schools was first set, as I mentioned earlier, by New Jersey versus TLO. And in that case, what the court said is that schools have a special interest in maintaining the safety of their students. And so that justified the lower standard of searches within schools. So what is the difference between reasonable suspicion, which is what we have now, and probable cause, more specifically? Well, it's kind of vague, but the best definitions, the clearest definitions that I've seen of probable cause describe it as more than a likely chance that a person is committing a crime, and that's a determination that you make based off of evidence. Whereas reasonable suspicion is thought more of as a hunch. So, whereas with probable cause, you need some sort of concrete evidence and not just proof of some chance that someone's committing a crime, but more than likely chance of committing a crime, it's certainly seen to be a much higher standard than the current standard. Something that's important to note, however, is that the implementation of the probable cause standard does not necessarily include the warrant requirement or the requirement of officials to get a court-ordered warrant before they search someone. That's something else entirely. But the two things are often seen as related because in New Jersey versus TLO, they decided that both reasonable suspicion would be established in schools, and they waived the warrant requirement within schools. However, just because that case did both of those two things doesn't necessarily mean that reinforcing the probable cause standard would also put back into place the warrant requirement. They were both kind of taken away on that same kind of justification of maintaining safety within schools, but that doesn't necessarily mean that implementing probable cause would also mean implementing a warrant requirement. And that can be a very important distinction on this topic. There might be teams who are using some kind of argument argument that's based off of proving that the warrant requirement would be used in schools in the wake of implementing probable cause. For example, a negative team might argue that if we were to implement probable cause, the warrant requirement means it would take very long for school officials to search a student, which means that crime could happen in the meantime. But you could answer that if you're the pro team by saying that implementing probable cause doesn't mean the warrant requirement. The two things are not synonymous. And that's something very feasibly you can do. So the next thing that we should understand about the resolution is the operative verb is the word ought. So ought generally means a moral obligation, and public forum isn't used to moral frameworks outside of utilitarianism or consequential utilitarianism, which is looking at whether the cost of something outweighs the benefits. That's the most standard way that people will try to prove whether we have an obligation to implement this policy. However, there are other moral frameworks that you can use, such as deontology, which I wouldn't recommend using because they are harder, and most judges, especially lay judges, aren't that receptive to them. Deontology is something that values the means of an action rather than its consequences, and whether the process of committing that action in and of itself is something that's a moral good or a moral harm. So something that you need to do if you want to run some kind of tricky moral framework, you need to, at the very basic level, do two things. The first thing is that you need to have very solid and very clear reasons for why to prefer your moral framework over the basic moral framework of utilitarianism and consequentialism. If you don't have that understanding, then you're not going to be able to gain any real offense off of a moral framework if you just say it and then don't explain why this is the way that the judge should be evaluating the round. Moreover, even if you have established justifications for why your moral framework is the most important thing, you need to make that flexible to whatever your opponents are running, and if they respond to your justifications, you need to be able to defend against their responses. So it's a lot of work to do that. That's part of the reason why I think it's very difficult to run a nuanced moral framework. And then the other thing you need to do is establish very, very clearly why your case links into that moral framework and theirs does not. Because otherwise they can co-opt the same kind of framework that you're running, and then you don't have any reason or advantage in the round that makes your case ultimately better. So those two things are typically very hard to establish, and that's why I don't recommend typically using an alternative moral framework to utilitarianism. That being said, if you are really passionate about it, you can work really hard to do those two things well, and then you can run whatever moral framework you please, as long as you're also very clear about explaining everything, especially when you have certain kinds of judges. So with that kind of definitional stuff out of the way, I'm going to now dive into impacts on this topic, because to me, impacts are where you really build the story of the round. If your case has impacts that don't really matter to society, then it's not really worth reading in the first place, right? If I'm running around with a machete, but everyone else is running around with a machine gun, then obviously that's a bit skewed, right? So we want to be looking at what some of the most influential, most impactful impacts are on this topic, and how we can then, the next step is what are the ways to link to that on both sides, and what are the best ways to link to that on both sides. So this topic does have a host of different impacts. So there's things like education, lives, rights, discrimination. What I'm going to argue are some of the best impacts on this topic are incarceration and violence and crime. So that kind of bubble of things. Because those things all link into education, lives, rights, and even discrimination in very intuitive ways. And because of that, they have lots of weighing value due to their flexibility as impacts. I don't want to take too much of a detour in explaining all the way that these things interact, but there's a pretty sizable body of literature on the impacts of crime and incarceration that should be pretty easy research for most of you to come across. Something that's cool about, or not cool, but something that's makes incarceration a very good impact in particular, is that it has a very damaging, irreversible impact, especially when we're talking about students. So there's lots of evidence that even just committing a juvenile offense increases the likelihood of committing later offenses down the line. And the longer your criminal record grows, the worse things get for you later down the line. Because a criminal record doesn't just go away. It's something that stays permanent to your record. And committing harsh enough crimes and like serving enough time in the jail system means that you can be shut out from employment. It even means in some cases that you can be shut out from voting and shut out from federal welfare programs. So at that point, you enter, people enter this underclass of society that's marginalized and treated very poorly and often forced into poverty. So like that's a very damaging condition, and that's something that you can link into either A, linking through directly to incarceration through arrest rates, or B, linking to crime, which also links to arrests typically because people who commit crimes often get caught. So like I said, those two things also, crime and incarceration, also link very heavily into disrupting the education environment, into saving lives, into taking away people's rights, i.e. the fact that felons can't vote, and into discrimination because these things often disproportionately affect minority communities. So now that we've established that these two things, crime and incarceration, are like very, very important impacts, how do we get to them? What are some of the best ways? So here's some of the things that I heard that I think are pretty good and pretty intuitive from what I've read. So on the pro side, one of the arguments that's become popular is this argument about like trust and criminalization. So the basic motto of this argument essentially is that when students are treated like criminals, they become criminals. An environment of constant searches that alienates students and makes them feel hostile towards the school environment, which can cause them to A, join gangs to find a different sense of community, or B, simply backlash against the school itself. So that comes at the consequence of more violence and ultimately more incarceration of students, both of which have like very disrupting and horrible impacts as we've just described. This argument does sound a little bit abstract on face, and that might be where its weakness lies, but there is good evidence for it, and there are authors who do heavily advocate this position, like Sarah Foreman in the Harvard Law Review. So I would look into it. I think it is a strong argument, and I think it is pretty runnable. So on the con side, the most common way that con teams link into this argument is through the SRO argument, or school resource officers. So basically this argument goes that probable cause would lead to an increase in SROs. And the reason for this is because teachers don't really know the standard of probable cause, which is more complicated, requires more legal knowledge, and they'd be too afraid to implement it. Schools are risk averse to lawsuits, so they would hire school resource officers to do searches rather than rely on teachers to do that and risk lawsuits. There's some evidence that actually suggests that officer training is a requisite component of probable cause, as well as officer experience. So because teachers can never really gain that kind of training and experience, schools, you could argue, would actually need SROs in order to conduct searches. So we'd see a massive spike in SROs in schools. So this has a pretty strong impact. It links both into incarceration and crime. So firstly, it can link into incarceration through increasing arrests for minor offenses, because typically when you have more police officers within schools, they begin to take the roles of disciplinarians and they start giving harsher penalties to students for things that they wouldn't have gotten as harshly penalized for. So for example, if a teacher sees two kids fighting in the hallway, then they might send one of them they might send both of them to the principal's office, maybe get them suspended, etc. But if an SRO sees something like a fight in the hallway, they're more inclined to arrest those kids either for like assault or battery, or for something like disorderly conduct, which is a charge that has a very vague definition, and so pretty much any rebellious kind of behavior can be considered disorderly conduct. So that gets kids started in the juvenile justice system very early for doing things that arguably shouldn't be penalized as harshly. And what that means is that severely reduces their chances of having successful life outcomes and increases their chances of ending up into the criminal justice system long term. The other impact that this had is increasing violence and crime in schools through increasing the sense of an authoritarian environment. So when I see police officers in my school, I get the sense that the school doesn't trust me, that it's actively combating me, and ultimately that puts me into an antagonistic position more so with my school. And that's why there's evidence that suggests that this kind of hostility creates increases in violence and crimes, and there are in fact empirics for this. But there are a couple issues with the SRO argument. For one, the link level isn't that great. There are lots of answers about how SROs are costly and how teachers can be trained in probable cause, or that administrators of the school can understand probable cause. So if you want to run this argument effectively, you need to be able to defend those link level responses. Otherwise, you won't be able to access the great impacts that I've just talked about. But the other thing, though, is that the impact level is disputable. There is some evidence that suggests that school resource officers deter crime from happening in schools and actually make schools safer. So you need to be really good at your reasoning with this argument to explain why ultimately school resource officers are detrimental and be able to interact with the logic of the other side of the impact. So those are some of the basic ways that people link into those crime and incarceration, etc. But I think some of the more cooler ways that people have been doing it more recently is through changes in overall school security policy that would be implemented by probable cause. Because probable cause only affects so much. It only affects student searches. But if changing the standard of searches also has other exterior effects on school policy, then that is much more significant and can affect much more students. So for example, on the con, the way that typically con teams will run this is through running some kind of trade-off argument. So if schools can't use searches as much due to the higher evidence standard of probable cause, then they will likely use other means, such as like drug sniffing dogs, which aren't considered a search, security cameras, metal detectors, etc. And so when they begin implementing some of these things, that like bites into the impact of the increasing an authoritarian prison-like environment, which the AF team will often try to be claiming that they're like breaking down. But if the con team actually proves that you're creating a more holistic authoritarian environment through these broad, sweeping security policy measures which affect more people than searches would, then ultimately you're making a much more prison-like environment for students, and that alienates far more students than we would be in the status quo. But the affirmative has some ground on this issue as well through these discourse type arguments that are also kind of interesting. So the argument essentially goes that changing the standard of probable cause has a chance to change the way that we view students. New Jersey versus TLO was based off of the understanding in part that students are a security threat themselves to the school environment, and therefore they need their rights to be restricted. Essentially, we treat students like second-class citizens, like criminals within our schools. So if we decriminalize the school environment by granting them more rights, then that sets the standard for freedom and protection of students. Whereas right now, there's lots of evidence that the rights of students are steadily being degraded and are being eroded as more authoritarian school-to-prison pipelines and securitization type policies get implemented. So changing the standard of probable cause reverses this trend that we're seeing in the status quo and ultimately decriminalizes the school environment, changes the way we see students, and therefore we're likely to see less punitive policies that like alienate students and send them to prison, and that means less violence and less incarceration, which we've already established are pretty significant impacts. Again, this is kind of a vague argument, but I think its rhetoric can be very powerful, and there are authors who talk about this, like Sarah Foreman and Aaron Davenport. Even if it's not like as specific as we'd like it to be, I think you can use like lots of different analysis and lots of different pieces of evidence to piece together this argument. So basically that's everything that I have to say. That's my experience on this topic. I would encourage everyone to get the champion briefs in order to gain a greater depth of understanding than I can possibly provide in a 20-minute video. There's lots of different ways that you can approach this topic, and I think the champion briefs is a great start for the kind of evidence and argumentation that you're going to need. All right, with that, everybody, good luck in September, October.